Have you ever wondered what life was like for medieval sailors navigating the treacherous seas? In the Middle Ages, European sailors were pivotal in connecting nations through perilous maritime voyages. Despite facing immense dangers and harsh conditions, these brave adventurers took to the seas, driven by necessity and ambition. Today, we explore the lives, motivations, and challenges of these medieval sailors. Starting with the infamous Vikings and moving through the evolution of maritime trade in Europe. The history of medieval sailors begins with a group everyone has heard of: the Vikings. The Vikings were active from the 9th to the 11th century. They were armed groups, essentially pirates, who conducted raids and massacres across Western Europe, becoming a significant threat to many nations. Many of these Vikings originally lived on the Scandinavian peninsula in northern Europe. At that time, the Scandinavian peninsula was unsuitable for agriculture, and the people there survived by bartering goods from the mountains and seas. When this was no longer enough to sustain them, they began crossing the seas to survive. The peninsula, with its numerous bays and inlets, provided ideal conditions for the development of maritime and shipbuilding technologies. Thus, the Vikings became an exceptionally skilled group of sailors. They would raid lands they reached by sea, establish bases, and expand their influence. With their advanced maritime skills and military power, the Vikings continued their rapid conquests and eventually brought wide areas of Europe under their control. While the image of the Vikings as fearsome invaders is strong, they were also excellent merchants. Most of the people crossing the seas as Vikings were originally farmers or fishermen. Many aimed to obtain wealth more stably through trade rather than risky raids. These Vikings expanded their activities from the Mediterranean to the Islamic world, becoming powerful merchants. So, what goods did the Vikings carry on their ships as merchants? First and foremost, they sought silver. They traveled to various places by ship to obtain silver coins circulating in Western Eurasia. In exchange for silver, the primary commodity the Vikings offered was people slaves. At the time, slaves were essential to maintaining society, performing various types of labor. The Vikings captured prisoners in battle and traded them for silver. This commerce was very characteristic of the Vikings, embodying both piracy and merchant activities. In addition, due to the demand for walrus and narwhal tusks as substitutes for ivory in Europe, the Vikings also traded these marine animal tusks as commodities. Other important trade goods transported by ship included food and resources from the Nordic regions, where the Vikings were based. By conducting repeated expeditions from the Nordic regions to various places and engaging in trade, the Vikings significantly influenced the European economy. However, their activities gradually declined around the 11th century, leading to a shift in maritime dominance to emerging merchant guilds. This was because they began to settle in the lands they had conquered, building states and communities, and their way of life gradually merged with the local life. As their lifestyle changed, their characteristics as pirates and seafaring merchants gradually diminished. And eventually, the Vikings disappeared from the seas. However, even after the Vikings disappeared, the trade routes they pioneered continued to play an important role, and their maritime skills were passed down. The beneficiaries of this legacy were, of course, the merchants. Merchants from the early Middle Ages to the mid-13th century are sometimes described as traveling merchants. They carried their goods and traveled from place to place, conducting business while on the move. However, at that time, much of the sea was unknown, and voyages were dangerous, with the risk of being attacked en route. They wanted to trade but feared the sea. Thus, they came up with an idea. Merchants unfamiliar with the sea began forming commercial groups to travel together. Among these groups was the Gotland Merchants League, an organization that played a crucial role in facilitating long-distance trade during this period. The name Gotland in this league refers to an island that had once flourished as a Viking stronghold and attack base. The maritime knowledge and skills brought by the Vikings were certainly inherited by the people of Gotland. Thus, people who wanted to cross the sea, especially merchants from various parts of Germany, relied on the excellent maritime skills of the people of Gotland to conduct long-distance trade expeditions to places like Russia and distant islands. Within the Gotland Merchants League, people from different origins, who usually had no connection, would come together, unite, and collaborate on voyages. For those attempting to conduct business in unknown and potentially dangerous lands, the presence of comrades was indispensable. And the people of Gotland, inheriting the skills left by the Vikings, were active sailors. However, many organizations at that time were formed with one-time contracts for each voyage and would disband once the journey was completed. Nevertheless, the activities of these merchants at the time laid the foundation for further organizational development, which would support the economic development of medieval Europe. During the Viking era and with the advent of merchant guilds in the late 13th century, maritime trade in medieval Europe reached a significant turning point. Around the 11th century, Mediterranean trade centered around Italy began to flourish, emphasizing the importance of sea-based commerce. This led to the emergence of a new entity in the late 13th century: maritime shipping companies that specialized in transporting merchants' goods. As mentioned earlier, up until the mid-13th century, merchants themselves often transported their trade goods by forming merchant guilds and personally boarding ships. However, with the advent of maritime shipping companies, merchants and sailors who transported goods by ship became distinct, specialized professions. Merchants no longer had to risk going to sea themselves but could instead entrust their goods to shipping companies. The sailors employed by these shipping companies were responsible for all aspects of maritime transport, from loading the cargo entrusted to them by merchants to the operation of the ships and unloading the cargo at the destination. The captains who hired and commanded these sailors often co-owned the ships with merchants and also acted as sales agents at the destination, revealing a dual role as both ship operators and merchants. The emergence of these organized shipping companies brought significant changes to medieval European commerce. The clear division of roles between merchants and sailors enabled more efficient maritime transport. Consequently, in the late 13th century, trade between distant regions flourished, and the diversity of goods transported by ship increased. So, what kind of goods were transported by these ships at the time? One of the most highly demanded and valuable commodities was woolen cloth. Made from sheep's wool, woolen cloth was a primary material for clothing in the cold European climate. Particularly vibrant and high-quality woolen cloth was a symbol of wealth and status and was highly prized among the elite. Similarly, fur was traded as a luxury item. Wine was also crucial as a drink. It was highly valued as a drink for kings and a sacred beverage, making it a valuable commodity. Transporting wine in large barrels made it a particularly heavy cargo, necessitating maritime transport. Additionally, spices maintained strong popularity among the wealthy, with people willing to spend large sums to acquire them. Beyond luxury items, there were essential trade goods for all people, such as grains. Medieval Europe was an agricultural society, but production was unstable, and many regions often faced food shortages. Particularly in urban areas, securing a stable food supply was vital, making grains a frequently traded commodity. Due to the influence of Christianity, which prohibited meat consumption on certain days, the demand for fish was also high, leading to its frequent transport. Other items transported by ship included beer, perfumes, amber, and various other goods, which traveled across Europe by sea. Now, let's explore the individuals who worked as shipping company employees responsible for operating these ships. Within the context of the social structure of the time, in medieval Europe, merchants with economic power became influential figures in urban areas. It is said that merchants comprised about 15% of the upper echelons of society, holding autonomy in cities. The middle class, which included small-scale merchants, craftsmen, and individuals like captains of shipping companies, made up about 43% of the population. The remaining 42% consisted of the wage laborer class, which included ordinary sailors. There was a significant disparity in the lives of people at the time based on class. For example, children of merchants could attend school and learn to read and write. Individuals entrusted with the role of captain had opportunities to acquire the knowledge and skills necessary for navigation. However, many sailors from the laborer class received no education and could not even read or write. Thus, they had to learn navigational knowledge orally from senior sailors. The voyages these sailors undertook were constant battles against the dangers of the sea. The job of a medieval European sailor was far more perilous than land-based work, with their lives constantly at risk. At the time, navigational technology was still in its early stages. The earliest tools to determine a ship's position appeared around the 12th century. The property of the magnet pointing north became known in the 13th century, with navigational compasses and sea charts becoming widespread from the 14th century onwards, in the late medieval period. During voyages in the early to mid-medieval period, predicting the weather or determining the ship's direction was challenging. There were no techniques to read wind directions and avoid storms, so ships were always at risk of shipwreck. At that time, technology to sail against the wind was still unknown. If the weather was uncertain, ships either waited without setting sail or returned to the port of departure when the wind changed to a favorable direction. Even then, encountering bad weather after setting sail was possible, and in such cases, sailors often had to jettison the cargo to prevent the ship from sinking. Additionally, they were targeted by pirates on the high seas, risking not only their cargo but also their lives. Besides pirates, sea creatures were also a source of great fear for sailors. To the people of the time, sea animals were mysterious and terrifying, giving rise to numerous legends. In such a perilous environment, sailors relied on their experience and intuition to navigate the dangerous seas. As mentioned earlier, many sailors could not read or write, so even if they had sea charts, they could not interpret them. They embarked on voyages relying solely on orally transmitted knowledge and experience, and in times of crisis, their only recourse was to pray to God. Now, let's take a look at how the medieval sailors, who were literally risking their lives, were compensated for their perilous work. The wages of captains and sailors were paid by the merchants who owned the cargo. However, they were only compensated if the cargo was safely delivered to its destination. This meant that if the ship was wrecked or attacked by pirates and the cargo was lost, despite risking their lives through dangerous labor, their compensation would be zero. Additionally, the sailors' wages were not fixed and varied, depending on the type and amount of cargo, the length of the voyage, and the level of danger involved. Consequently, their income was unstable, and choosing to become a sailor was akin to a gamble with one's life. Nevertheless, because of the high risk, the wages upon successful completion of the voyage were said to be higher than those of land-based workers. Many might have chosen the profession of a sailor hoping for a better life compared to working on land. For the working class, being a sailor was a high-risk, high-reward occupation. In medieval Europe, many took to the seas for voyages and the promise of high wages. However, as time passed, the motivations for going to sea changed. After the late Middle Ages, European ships began to explore routes to Africa, Asia, and the Americas, ushering in the Age of Exploration. During this period, adventurous young men boarded ships aiming for unknown lands. Additionally, soldiers joined sea voyages in search of new territories. Ships, which had primarily existed for merchants, began to be used for various purposes, leading to an unceasing demand for ships and sailors. However, there were also people who, despite their desires, could not become sailors' women. In medieval Europe, it was considered bad luck for women to be on ships, and thus female sailors were generally non-existent. Yet, even in such times, there were brave women who disguised themselves as men to board ships. It is well known that during the Age of Exploration, women like Anne Bonny and Mary Read made names for themselves as female pirates in the Caribbean. However, the history of female sailors is said to date back even further than the Age of Exploration. This fact came to light in 2017 when DNA analysis revealed that the remains found in a 10th century Viking grave in Sweden were those of a woman. Furthermore, the grave goods indicated that she was likely a distinguished warrior among the Vikings. Additionally, 10th century documents mention female pirates, including a legend of the female warrior Igarua who led Viking raids into Ireland. In the 14th century, there was Jeanne de Clisson, a French noblewoman. Jeanne, who vowed revenge against the French king who executed her husband, became a pirate herself and repeatedly attacked French ships. It is said that she spared one sailor from each attack to serve as a messenger to convey her vengeful spirit. Known for her strength and ferocity, she was nicknamed the Lioness of Brittany. Despite the times when women becoming sailors was unheard of, Those who sought to board ships did so with a strong personal conviction towards the sea. Whether for business, adventure, or revenge, those who boarded ships did so with hopes for trade goods, wages, or new lands, each with their own goals. However, the life on board to reach those hopes was anything but enjoyable. It was extremely harsh. Life on medieval ships was cramped and uncomfortable. Ordinary sailors had to live crammed into very tight spaces with no hope for privacy. The unsanitary conditions, with rats running around, often led to the spread of infectious diseases. The lack of hygiene also affected drinking water, which sometimes went bad and became undrinkable. Therefore, alcohol like wine or beer, which was safer than water, was the common drink on ships at that time. This was not for the sake of enjoying a drink, but rather because they had no choice but to drink alcohol for safety. Additionally, food was mainly preserved food, as cooking on board was rare due to the risk of fire. Sailors had to continually eat hard bread, salted meat, and dried fish, all cold. Even these meager food supplies were not abundant on board. The primary role of ships was to transport cargo, making it difficult to load ample food and drink, and long voyages often required frequent resupply at ports, living on a knife edge. Naturally, such a diet led to various nutritional deficiencies among sailors, the worst being scurvy caused by a lack of vitamin C. Consuming only preserved foods like dried meat and hard bread every day. Sailors rarely had access to fresh vegetables or fruits, leading to severe vitamin C deficiency. However, at that time, the cause of scurvy was completely unknown, and sailors succumbed one by one to this dreadful disease. The symptoms of scurvy were akin to the body falling apart. Gums turned black and rotted, old fractures re-broke, and old wounds reopened. The bodies of such patients emitted a terrible stench and creaked as if they were falling apart. This decay extended to blood vessels and brain nerves. Patients who suffered brain damage experienced hallucinations and vivid dreams indistinguishable from reality. These hallucinations and dreams reflected what the body desperately needed. During the grueling voyage, what ailing sailors' bodies craved most was, of course, delicious food. Therefore, patients who awoke from dreams and hallucinations to realize there was no actual food were devastated, feeling even more despondent. The misery of scurvy patients, whose bodies deteriorated and who lamented through hallucinations, must have caused immense fear among the other sailors in the confined, inescapable ship. Such scurvy plagued sailors from the Middle Ages through the Age of Exploration, and signs of overcoming. It only appeared in the latter half of the 18th century. Due to the harshness of life aboard these ships, sailors of that era had short lifespans, with many not living to see 30 years old. The loneliness of being separated from their homeland and families by long voyages, along with the uncertainty of whether they would return alive, surely wore down their bodies and minds. In this way, medieval European sailors led harsh lives aboard cramped, unsanitary ships. Battling raging seas, pirates, disease, and loneliness, they braved their voyages at the risk of their lives. The wealth and culture that spread across the seas from Europe at that time enriched and moved the world thereafter. However, these benefits were built upon the courage and endurance of the medieval sailors. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more insightful content. Take care and see you in the next video. Goodbye.